the Honourable Mr Howard, General the Honourable Archangel, Sir Peter, Your Excellency, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's been 14 years since I left the Navy, and I've spent the last few years chasing cattle around the Tweed Valley. But East Timor is very important to me. It's almost 20 years ago today I sat on the bridge of Wing of Success on a beautiful balmy evening, transiting down to the Akusi Enclave, when the ship's navigator came out to me and said, "What do you think the situation in East Timor will be in 20 years' time? Will East Timor still be free? How's it all going to pan out?" Big questions. He was keen to know what the outcome would be in East Timor, and would the country develop, the new country develop, into a successful nation. To understand my position, you had to go back some 24 years to 1975, when I brought the patrol boat attack back to Darwin in early December. Shortly after arriving back, there was an operational briefing. The Indonesians had moved into East Timor on December the 7th, about a week after we arrived, and all of a sudden there was an operational situation called the Services Assisted Evacuation. The concept was to proceed to Dili and transport the Australians plus any others who were still trapped in Dili and bring them back to Australia. Briefings were conducted and planning completed. We were going to sail from Darwin should the RAAF not be given approval to land. Well, the RAAF did get approval to land and our mission was cancelled. So I stood by for the next few months watching what was going on. And like most of the Western world, Australia had acquiesced to Indonesians' invasion of East Timor. And 3 years later, Australia announced its decision to recognise de facto the province was part of Indonesia. So I told him to come back here 24 years later as part of this operation was a fitting way for me to finish my operational career. I had unfinished business, as did Australia. And I was so proud to be part of the operation. I was confident that we would do well given the early successes and that the East Timorese would get their freedom back. I believe that he would also be proud of being a part of the operation and navigator of success because of the crucial logistic role that success played. Now, what do I think about the legacy of the ADF intervention in East Timor? Firstly, there are lots of lessons to be learned from the intervention. However, what did we implement and what changes, improvements? And we've heard Sir Peter Cosgrove talk about some of those issues. One of the big things I think was the ADF reputation, interoperability and command and control, capability, force, structure and logistics, and I've lumped a lot of these together to sort of save a bit of time, regional relationships and intelligence and readiness. The successful international INTERFET deployment from September 1999 to February was a crisis intervention rather than an outright conflict. Its aim was to provide a peaceful and secure environment in which the United Nations could conduct humanitarian assistance and nation building. However, for the ADF, it became a watershed marking not only the largest deployment of Australian military forces overseas since World War II, but also the first time that Australia had provided the core force for a UN-mandated enforcement operation. Both these had a both of these had more than a transitory significance, and they demonstrated the willingness of our government, the Australian government, to employ ADF offshore in a manner that few local defence analysts or policy makers had expected. Instead of operating in our traditional role as a more junior partner of either a British or an American-led nation, led coalition in East Timor, Australia acted as the chief contributor and lead nation. and the nation with the will, the capability, competence and influence to provide the essential elements of political consultation and the military leadership to coordinate the planning, mounting and execution of a military operation. It was a big step up in my service career, that's for sure. I strongly support the belief that the involvement in the INTERFET deployment stretched our resources, no doubt about it. It was a combined, joint, coalition force, and that enabled the completion of the mission. It took some time to pull it together. The challenges of leading a multinational force took considerable effort at all levels, not only in the military, but at the government and departmental levels as well. I don't believe that we had the intergovernmental HKADF command organisation or the operational command and control that we needed to implement our role as a lead nation at the start. But who does, I would ask? Every operation is different. And it's a matter of putting together, as the situation evolves, the organisation and the structure that you need. Well, it worked out over the first few weeks of planning, and our systems worked. The ADF reputation, very important to the Australian government, and I think the government got confidence in the early days that we could actually perform the job. They saw 3,000 troops and all the logistic support needed for the first weeks of operation there within the first 24 to 48 hours, which was an amazing achievement. And so they got a lot of confidence for us at the time and in future operations. International respect for the ADF was also enhanced, not only from those countries who participated, but from all those who watched as well. There was an expectation internationally and within Australia that any substantial on the ground presence would have to be there quickly, and for Australia the biggest feature of it was that it was under our leadership that it happened. Regionally, governments and militaries saw firsthand whether they participated or watched closely, and also gained confidence and respect for the ADF. Indonesia, while on one hand experienced a sense of outrage at Australia's involvement, were also very impressed with the INTERFET operations and the speed with which we were deployed and the capability that we brought. Regional defence relationships, unilateral and multilateral, remain a key element of Australia's approach to regional defence engagement, as we have shared strategic interests and perceptions. And just as important, I think the Australian electorate and community also got a pride and a confidence within the locals about how the ADF performed. I think they're non-committal usually, they like to sit back and watch, and then when we did it and it all went well, I think they were extremely proud. Finally, there was also an improvement in the way we dealt with each other in the ADF. There was a renewed respect and a new understanding of how we operated together, which wasn't there in the first phase, but grew very quickly as we learnt each other's business. And I think today I see that Australia's participation in international and regional exercises is still highly sought after and should be continued. We had some great relationships, and we talked down a lot of situations because of those relationships. I remember one occasion that the Maritime Commander flew to East Indonesia and spoke to the Indonesian Eastern Fleet Maritime Commander and asked him to remove his submarines from the area and also to tell us where his other forces were going to be, so that there were no misunderstandings. And to be able to do that is based on the fact that we have good regional relationships and friendships. Interoperability and C2, they're closely aligned and they need to complement each other. Interoperability at all levels is essential for every operation. From a naval perspective, we had a shared common naval tactical picture, we had procedural doctrine, and we shared many warfare publications. The challenge was the command and control which came directly from the diverse nature of participants and the primacy of their own national objectives. Sometimes they were different, so tasking was often based on a daily requirement and often required both the General and myself to go out and say, what are you cleared to do? What can you do in this operation? I would like you to go to Darwin and collect, more equipment. Or I'd like you to move some troops around. And they would then have to go back to their commands and come back to us and say, approved. And there was one occasion which was quite funny. I was trying to get troops ashore in Suai, and it was a heavy lift requirement. And the Americans were the only one who had a heavy lift requirement, helicopter requirement, or capability, and the French were just sailing into the area as well. And I said to the American Commodore, I said, sir, you know, the French are willing to help us if you can't. He just looked at me and said, no way we're going to let the French get away with that. We had the helicopters the next day, we checked their own. One of the interoperability issues is the international transfer of information and the clash of security levels and requirements. So on the one hand, I had a picture at the headquarters, which was UK, US, eyes only, and over this side there was a tactical picture which everybody, maritime INTERFET. And in the end it got so difficult to separate the two, I got rid of the secret four eyes only system and put it out to sea and just had the local picture because I had people coming and going all the time. And one has to be careful that you don't breach that security because then you lose the confidence of the big guys in the picture. At the start, there was, in my opinion, as I said before, very little understanding of the differences in the culture between each services. There were no clashes. We all had our roles and functions, but we had different ways of doing business. As the operation got better, or more time passed, we got better understanding of each other. And I think that relationship continues today. We're much closer as a result of that operation than we were before. That sounds pretty basic, but not where humans are involved. People. People are always people and they will make things difficult. So there was often times where we had to compromise, we had to bend, but we did it. And the rewards were fabulous. Today it seems, from a distance to me, 14 years since I've been in these hollowed grounds, I've been privy to a couple of presentations by Admiral Johnson, and there now seems to me to be the clearer lines that General Cosgrove was talking about. That new command structure and that organisation not only within defence but with government departments. And that took a few years to get together because another operation I was involved in was the refugee crisis. And with that, I found it very difficult to communicate what was actually happening to what Mr. Howard needed to know back in Canberra so he could make decisions about what part of Australia was Australia, what part of Australia, how do you stop these people? Do you just pick them up and run a ferry service from Ashmore Island to Darwin? Do we keep them at sea? One of the funny things was one of the guys came back to me and said, I'll get a cruise ship. And you can have a cruise ship and we'll put all these people on a cruise ship. And I said, do you really understand the problem here? But anyhow, I'm just making the point that it's very difficult to, I mean, can you imagine if I put 1,500 refugees on a cruise ship with their cabins and everything else, and they don't talk to each other, they come from different parts of the world, they're hostile towards each other. It would have been a very interesting situation. But to relay that back and say, actually, no, I'm better just putting them on my Manoora and Canimbla and splitting up areas is a much better situation. Moving on, capability and force structure and logistics. Our role throughout Stabilise was to support the land forces in achieving their goals by inserting the maximum combat forces in the minimum amount of time. Our maritime focus, planning focused on an area of surveillance, protection of sea lines, communications, all the usual Navy stuff, so to speak, and the provision of sea lift capability. I think we had the necessary maritime assets to cover surveillance, sea lines of communications, port clearance, escort duties, and the international mixture of surface ships, the hydrographic services. Who would believe that you need a hydrographic service coming into Dili? Well, we didn't know what was there. There were ships alongside, sunk, there were wrecks in the harbour, there was a whole range of issues to deal with. And of course, we had fuel supply with HMNZS Endeavour and HMAS Success. But we also had the occasional US tanker who passed through the area, who was given to us, who kept pumping the necessary oils into Success so she didn't have to leave the area of operations. Sustainment was our most difficult challenge facing the planning team, and our significant shortfall was in heavy lift. It was Churuk and Jarvis Bay. Singapore gave us great support through their LSTs, and other nations later came along with some heavy lift capabilities, but really big restrictions in what we could do with them. No, we're not going to Darwin. No, we're not going to do this. Okay, what will you do? Interesting. So to ease the issue, we instituted what we called, an acronym is called STUFFED. Ships taken up from trade. So I had a mate who worked in P&O, I think it was, in Melbourne, and I gave him a ring and I said, Peter, what ships have you got available in your area of operations up here now, particularly cargo ships that I could place a lot of equipment on? He came back to me within 24 hours with a list of ships. And so the ships taken up from trade were then put into a naval control of shipping organisation, which has been, you know, World War II, World War I for the convoy system and everything else. And we managed to control all those ships all the way to Darwin, offload them, and provide the services, I think, that were needed. Now, today's new naval capability plan, with the addition of Adelaide and Canberra, the new air warfare destroyers, I see them as meeting the future needs quite well. And Adelaide and Canberra certainly would have come in handy in East Timor. The visible presence of ships has been discussed and certainly demonstrated a capability, but also a commitment both to the Indonesians and to the ADF on shore. It also demonstrated to the Allies that we had a credible force to deal with. I didn't use any submarines in East Timor, and I can't discuss a lot of the reasons why, but a fully fledged war at sea or a larger area of operations at sea would have demanded that I have that capability. So the addition of the capability paper with the submarines is very important. But probably nuclear, not conventional. If I was an AO man out there now, and it's a long time to get down the nuclear road, my personal opinion is that nuclear submarines will be far more valuable to me than conventional. Having said that, the conventional submarines are excellent in smaller areas. I think we need to remain cautious with our force structure planning, not to plan for yesterday or for minor operations and distractions, but on full warfighting capabilities. We need to prepare for the worst situation, because it's always easy to dumb down, but you can't always smart up quickly. Last but not least is intelligence and readiness. I think that intelligence and readiness go hand in hand in East Timor. I don't believe we fully leveraged the intelligence we had into the day's events. Again, a personal opinion. I always had a question after briefings, both from ashore and from afloat, because I used to get them on board as well. And even later in USN exercises and operations as well. My big question was, so what? You get presented the what. My question was, so what? How's it going to make my day or break my day? What do I need to do in terms of, or what do I need to think about in terms of force disposition and everything else? Well, I've been told recently by the director of the RA and Warfare School that the intelligence position now includes what, so what, and what next. And that to me represents a significant change in the value chain of intelligence into future operations. Because we all knew what had happened the day before because we read about it. What we wanted to know was what was going to happen tomorrow. It'd be great to know the future, and most of us think we can predict it to a point. The future role of artificial intelligence in planning options and testing possible courses of action is also a very exciting option, and one which I believe is worth exploring. I'm disappointed that Raytheon isn't here, because to me, the use of artificial intelligence to sort of help you along the way and give you results would be a good outcome. Last but not least is readiness. It's also a complicated issue. Readiness for what? And as Commodore Flotillas, my biggest job was always to convince people to give me money to keep ships at an operational level of capability. That's expensive and it takes a lot of time. And to convince government that you need that money, you need that fuel, you need that munitions, you need that submarine time or what have you, is something that we don't do very well. But we need to practice, and I watch the SAS do this fantastically. They practice what they're actually going to do before they get there. Oftentimes in the ADF, we don't get the opportunity to practice what we're about to do practically. Now, simulation is good and it has its role, but at some stage you've actually got to get out there and do it, because you fight the way you train. In conclusion then, Operation Stabilise is a great success, and due mainly to the leadership team that the Archangel put together, I believe. In historical terms, some people consider it was an enormous undertaking. I disagree. I think it was an enormous undertaking. Crucial to the operation of the ADF's operation was the deliberate and concerted effort in the past decade to foster relations with regional and international allies. In the maritime sphere, long practice policies of naval cooperation, years of training together, standardised doctrine, together with familiarity with often common equipment, assured the required levels of operation and interoperability. The ADF learnt many lessons, with some improvements implemented as a result of our intervention in East Timor. You will not get everything right beforehand, and therefore you will still need to rely on the people. The people need to demonstrate the diligence, determination and the flexibility to bring the force together and achieve the aim. Thank you very much.
So I'm grateful that Jerry Wheeler of Raytheon, National Affairs Manager, is here to hoist those messages in.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see you sitting. You were sitting there before, yeah.
Just one, if I can, before we thank you, Jim, is having got all this experience, having interacted with both Army and Air Force in East Timor, operating the diplomatic space, what did the Navy do in the 4 to 5 years that followed to extract, before you retired, all of the wisdom, insight, good ideas that it might have from your hands-on experience? What did they do to say, look, this Stapleton has done a really good job, let's learn from him what actually happened?
Oh, they sent me to Washington as the naval attaché, which was great. No, I think I still had a couple of years as Commodore Flotillas after that, and I tried to instill the levels of readiness that I spoke about that you needed, and the capability for, concentrating on readiness, intelligence, and the future capability, which is why I went to the United States.
But you got those things. What did the service get?
Oh, they've got the capability now, and when you look at the CN's capability plan, you can see that that capability plan is based on all the things that the General has said, and it really is a good force. Mind you, my personal opinion is not nuclear, submarine, waste of space, but that's just a personal opinion.
we'll come to that at the end of the day for ulterior reasons. But can I ask, what were the Americans interested in what you had learnt and seen?
Well, they were gobsmacked we achieved with what we had. I mean, I used to fly out to the amphibious ready group every few days because they were nervous and they thought they would have to participate. They thought, that, what are we going to do? How come you haven't bombed anybody? How come you haven't killed lots of people yet? You know, all this sort of stuff. And it sounds funny, but it's not, because they think totally differently. And you're saying, well, actually, we didn't need to kill anybody today. It was sort of close on a couple of occasions, but they were always ready to lend assistance, okay, always ready to come ashore and help. And they thought they would. So their reaction was, how did you do it? And when you sit back and you say, well, we'd use the diplomatic channels, we'd use the operational connections, regional engagement and all this sort of stuff, they got the message. And so, although having said that, I then went, after 9/11, and I went over to Washington, and I heard them talk about the second Gulf War and patting themselves on the back at a few things. I sort of stood back and I raised my hand at one morning session. I put my hand up and I said, it's wonderful what you have done, and to win the war in so many days, and everything was fantastic. But have you ever given any thought to what you left behind? Have you ever given any thought to what you're talking about how Iraq and how all these places would come together again afterwards? It's like, what? And the effort was on military operations, and that's great, but there was no follow-up to, how do we stop that, prevent that again? And in my next life, I went to the Middle East as working for Bahrain, actually, the National Security Agency for 4 years or what have you. And I learned I learned more in those 4 years about the Middle East, and well, I don't know anything really, but I learnt more than I knew before I went there. It's a very delicate situation, and it's one which makes our area of complexity look very, very simple. So they needed to work on that, and I didn't see any move towards that sort of diplomacy or that sort of relationship building or things which I believe helped us do what we did with the minimum force which we used.
Much food for thought. Would you please thank Jim Sutton?